Hi, this is Take the Flight, and I'm talking about converting a Tower Hobbies Chaos to electric power. So, I would recommend that you start by reading this really excellent article in Sport Aviator e-zine by Frank Granelli. He reviews the Tower Hobbies Chaos, and he makes the point that the Tower 46 engine turns an APC 11.6 at 11,300, and that this was a great match for this airframe. So, the question is, how do we match that performance with electricity? This is a really nicely built ARF, and it's very familiar, and it's been around for a long time, and this really tempted me to go the extra mile to find that perfect match. So the first question is, what sort of power plant do we use for this project? I chose the Firepower 40 from Heads Up RC, which is nominally set up at 600 kV, though my sample seemed to be wound a little bit hotter at about 625. And most importantly, this motor has a 40 millimeter case diameter. You really need something no bigger than 40 to fit into the nose of the Chaos, which, like most old pattern ships, is relatively narrow. I was able to get this motor to turn a Zor 11.6 at about 11,800 fresh and about 11,000 at the end of a reasonable sport flight. This is not going to win you any pattern contests, but I think it's going to give you a pretty good time flying this plane, provided you keep it light. So here you see the specs of the Chaos as published by Tower Hobbies. And we don't really know how heavy Frank's plane was. He doesn't say, but it's probably somewhere in this range of 5.5 to 6 pounds. I did not lighten the airframe like many e-conversion projects will do because I really wanted it to stay the way it was and fly somewhat the same. I used smaller than usual digital servos, at least smaller than usual by the standards of the 70s, and I used a separate one for the nose tiller, which I'll describe in more detail in a moment. And I used the heavy version of the Castle Ice speed controller with the heatsink because I wasn't quite sure if I'd get enough cooling air over it. And I used all the hardware that came with the kit, except the obvious stuff like the throttle servo. And lo and behold, I got 2270 grams all up weight, exactly 5 pounds, and a perfect balance, which is 10% light or lighter than the spec with no special work, which looked like a recipe for success. So here's an interesting point. I mounted the Firepower 40 off the front face of the motor, which is against the back of this firewall. I really like to do this because I was revving up to over 11,000, and I tried to make the analogy of grabbing the dumbbell in the middle. You've got the rotating mass of the propeller, the hardware used to mount the propeller, and the spinner on the one side of the firewall, and you've got the rotating bell housing on the back of the firewall. I really think it's better, mechanically speaking, when you're winding up to 11,000 to mount off a spot that's in between these two rotating masses instead of the more common practice of mounting it off the back end by flipping the outrunner around. The other advantage of mounting it this way is that it actually allows you to get some cooling air past the motor, and through this gap, I basically cut an orifice in the rear firewall, and that allows me to get some cooling air through the battery. And it also gives you a really convenient place to mount the speed controller. Of course, the disadvantage of this is that this section that you see here of the airframe really wasn't intended to take this sort of stress. So I beefed it up. I made a custom 9mm motor mount. I used the X yoke that comes with the motor as a big washer so I could really crank these screws down. And I pinned side doublers to the motor, to the nose, and epoxied them in with wood screws, which you really can't see in this photo, but they go through the side of the airframe and into the edge of this firewall that the motor is mounted to. And then I went right in and reinforced the cheeks on the inside as well with some pieces of scrap wood. This little piece of wood you see here is not structural. The only purpose it has is to keep the cables for the motor away from the rotating bell housing. That's a sort of a disadvantage of front mounting off the front face of the motor, because now the cables have to go all the way from this section past the rotating bell housing to the speed controller, but it's pretty easy to do with this technique of using some scrap wood. Here you see the all-important battery mounting location, which used to be the fuel tank in the case of the piston-powered Chaos, and used to be sealed. And I made a removable hatch with a magnet which is right under this little screw here, whose only purpose is to give you something to hang on to pull the magnet away. I put a couple of lips under it and all these perforations to let the slipstream suck the air out of the battery compartment. And I had to build a little picture frame around it so that I'd have some place for these lips to go into. At first, it didn't hold really well, so I added two more lips on the inside, and overall, it's been remarkably robust. So this was a bit of a tricky problem. How do you put nose weight in such a tight space where the motor is barely fitting to the nose? I kind of punted on this one. This is the bottom view of the fuselage. I bolted, or actually epoxied, a piece of hardwood to the bottom with a blind nut in it. And then I just drilled holes in a bunch of coins and started screwing them to the outside under the chin of the airplane, basically at the field, in order to do trimming and nose weight adjustments. And in the end, I didn't really need anything. I got lucky, or perhaps I was smarter than I thought, and I was able to balance the plane without adding any weights. By the way, I should point out that there is room to put the weights under the motor in the end if you need them. The only purpose of putting them on the outside is so you can make quick adjustments at the field. Moving on, here's my aileron servo. I had to make a custom platform for it because the digital servos are much smaller than the full-size ones that the Kaos was designed for. I also had to make another custom mount on the inside for these two. These are InoLab HGD250MGs, which are really nice digital servos that you can get from Hobby King. And the other thing I had to do, which I'm not quite sure how this is supposed to work, but I couldn't get the tiller pushrod to make a smooth, easy moving passage all the way back to the rudder servo. So I gave up and I mounted another separate little tiller servo over here just to operate the nose wheel. And that provided the additional benefit that using a programmable radio, I could tune the amount of nose wheel steering I had, and that was really useful. So here's a piece of cautioning advice that you get from Frank Donnelly in his article about reinforcing the area where the wing hold-down plate is mounted. Frank makes the point that if you crank down too hard on the mounting screws, this whole plate tends to buckle. And so, following his advice, I epoxied these three pieces of wood around the edge in order to reinforce that section. The only other thing that's really of note in this slide is right here. There's this collar with a set screw that holds the two dual elevator push rods together and connects them to the elevator servo. That kind of made me cringe. And so at the end, after everything was set up, I just wrapped that connecting point with fuse wire and soldered it shut. If you're a real nerd about this sort of thing like me, just get online and search for this particular string, 140222 Kaos conversion with a K, and you'll see my entire technical report on the chat groups, including the breakout of all the weights, the power settings, the power loadings, wing loadings, and all the details of the construction broken out as you see in the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is just, the section of the spreadsheet that you see here is just a teaser. The whole thing's about a page long. So if you're interested, please dive into it and by all means comment on my video. And now perhaps the most important thing of all, does it actually fly? Well, I only got to fly it once at the end of last season after the project was completed, and it took off very nicely, and I was able to land it crosswind without much trouble. I spent about 5 minutes flying around, trimming it at half throttle in a cross-windy, slightly gusting day, just to be on the safe side. I did one very big loop effortlessly, and I saw a little bit of a tail wag. I'm not quite sure what to make of that. And when I landed, I found that the 3000 milliamp battery pack had consumed less than a quarter of its total charge, which was really encouraging. This season, I will be getting someone to come out with a camcorder and making real videos, so please watch for them, and happy landings.